The game isn't over, of course. Class war is much too serious a matter to relinquish, but let's proceed to the universality of the Universal Declaration, of having dismissed Articles 13, 14, and 19 as inoperative by virtue of the extreme relativism of the United States with regard to the Universal Declaration. Well, these articles all fall within civil and political rights. That's the category that the U.S. considers privileged. I'll return to some more in that category if there's time. But first, let's have a look at the second category, the socio-political rights. Well, according to the principle of universality, these have the same status as the political and civil rights. But the leaders of the Western relativist challenge, they insist that the Universal Declaration must be modified in accord with their values, which assign no status to the socioeconomic principles. Jeane Kirkpatrick once described them as a letter to Santa Claus, not to be taken seriously. Morris Abrams, who's the U.S. representative to the UN Commission on Human Rights, was a few years ago, he spelled that out in explaining Washington's opposition to a convention that was being considered the Convention on the Right to Development. Here's the definition of it: the right of individuals, groups, and peoples to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights can be fully realized. Morris Abrams pointed out that these are not rights. In fact, they're preposterous, he said. They're, in fact, a dangerous incitement. The error of the Convention on the Right to Development is that it endorses the principle that everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care and social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Notice that's a virtual paraphrase of the right of development that's preposterous and a dangerous incitement. So therefore that must be preposterous, even a dangerous incitement, and we therefore abrogate Article 25 of the Universal Declaration, which I've just quoted. Notice that it includes the right to security, and in fact it's worker insecurity that is the key to the fairy tale, as the saintly Allen has explained. Well, the U.S. vetoed the Declaration on the Right to Development, effectively nullifying Article 25. I don't have to bother spending time on how well Article 25 is observed here. There are other elements involved in Article 25. The World Health Organization has pointed out that what it calls the devastation of hunger is clearly in violation of Article 25. It's transparent. They also pointed out that there are more deaths every 2 years from hunger than during both world wars. But that has no status from the relativist standard of the rich. In fact, the U.S. acts forthrightly to increase hunger. And that's the most striking example of that is the embargo against Cuba since 1962, which is the longest sanction in history and the only one that effectively bars food and medicine. That's a direct violation of Article 25. It's also a direct violation of a principle that the United States itself has introduced into at the Human Rights Commission. The U.S. At the Commission, the United States introduced a resolution declaring that the deliberate impeding of delivery of food and medical supplies to civilian populations is a violation of international humanitarian law, and those who commit it or order such acts are to be held individually responsible. That's fair and accurate. It's an accurate interpretation of international law, meaning people responsible for this should be brought before international tribunals. The reference is to Bosnia. But of course it applies very clearly to every president of the United States since the early 1960s. That, however, would be completely incomprehensible to Western relativists. Time's going on, and I won't have time to run through the rest, but if you run through the rest of the socioeconomic provisions, you discover that the respect for them is approximately comparable. The U.S. opposition to the Universal Declaration is so extreme and so deeply internalized among educated people that they simply can't comprehend when it's challenged. And that leads to some very strange results. For example, in the New York Times, on Human Rights Day a couple of years ago, December 10th, the editors condemned the countries of Asia that, as they put it, reject the Universal Declaration and call instead for addressing the more basic needs for people, for food and shelter, medical aid, and schools. Yeah, exactly in conformity with the Universal Declaration. But so how can that be rejection? Well, the reasoning is very simple. The United States rejects these provisions, so therefore they're null and void, and by upholding them, the third world relativists are rejecting them. All it takes is a good education to understand all of this, and an intellectual class that is willing to subordinate itself to power to quite a remarkable extent. This came up again a little bit later in a more kind of philosophical discussion in the New York Times about the U.S.-China relations. The article contrasted the American emphasis on individual freedom with the Chinese insistence, I'm quoting it, the Chinese insistence that the common good transcends personal rights. So China is calling for the right to food, clothing, shelter, education, the right to work, rest, reasonable payment, and it's criticizing the United States for not upholding these rights, which are all affirmed in the Universal Declaration, and incidentally are personal rights, but rights that the U.S. rejects. So the conclusion is this kind of ironic or puzzling because the U.S. is the champion of the universality of the Universal Declaration and somehow the Chinese are criticizing it. And the point is, it's easily understandable, China just doesn't understand the Western concept of human rights, which the relativist Western position led by the United States, China was insisting on the universality of the Universal Declaration, which the U.S. rejects. So that's all incomprehensible to properly educated people. Well, one of the crucial aspects of the Universal Declaration is a call for efforts to make sure that the rights described in words actually become law or become applicable. That's to be done by what are called enabling conventions that the United Nations will propose and that states will accept that implement particular aspects of the Universal Declaration. And there's a long series of these enabling conventions. For example, there's a Convention on Rights of the Child, 1989, which was accepted by most countries, not all, however. It was rejected by the United States and Somalia alone. There's an international covenant on civil and political rights. That was technically ratified by the United States, but with reservations. There was a reservation to Article 7, which states that no one shall be subject to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The reason why the U.S. refused to accept that part is that conditions in U.S. prisons and other practices like the death penalty are even for children. The U.S. is virtually alone in allowing juveniles to be executed. I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan do also. And U.S. prison practices have repeatedly been condemned, including by Human Rights Watch, as in violation of this article, and indeed in violation of Article 5 of the Universal Declaration, which prescribes cruel, inhuman, degrading punishment. Long studies by Human Rights Watch in this, so you'll have to look far to find them, unless you subscribe to Human Rights Watch publications.